Hello and welcome to Waly Gisnep's Animated Classics, a podcast where we're revisiting the Walt Disney animated classics to find the creme de la creme and see which ones are deserving of the title of a Waly Gisnep animated classic. My name is Liam. As always, I am joined by my friend Ben. Ben, what are we taking a look at today?
Today we are going into the weird and wonderful world of Alice in Wonderland, an adaptation of Lewis Carroll's two novellas, I guess? Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass. So going into this one, Liam, what are your memories, recollections and nostalgia for Alice?
First of all, I would like to wish you a very merry unbirthday.
If that's the tone we're having with this podcast, I think you and I are going to fall out very quickly.
This is the first film that we're revisiting that I definitely have a lot of nostalgia for. I watched this a lot as a kid, and even just rewatching it today, it all just comes back and you realise that so much of it is ingrained in my brain.
That certainly explains a lot about your brain.
Yeah, this film definitely has a lot to answer for, I think.
I, on the other hand, have seen this maybe 3 or 4 times in my entire life, and have very few recollections of it. In fact, I may well have read the books before I saw the film. That said, I do think it's a fairly faithful adaptation for the most part. Obviously, they don't cover every single part of the 2 books, but a lot of the sequences are taken pretty much line for line. A lot of the visuals were inspired by the original illustrations. So I think if nothing else, you can say it's a fairly faithful and loving adaptation of the source material.
That's probably my main point for this episode, is that it's very much an adaptation. And I think it's one of the best examples of an adaptation and the process of adapting to film, in that it's not obsessed with just retelling the story from the book, because in this case there's not really any story to tell, but it wants to take the tone of the source material and just translate that directly to a feature film. And in that regard, I think this is very successful, and as I say, one of the most successful adaptations.
Well, let's get started then with the structure of this film. As you say, to call it a story might be somewhat generous. That said, we open with the opening credits, and I know I've moaned about this before, but this is a fairly faithful adaptation of 2 books. There are 13 different people attributed to the story on this film. There are 6 attributed to drawing the backgrounds. Now, this film's about 1 hour and 10 minutes long. That means, on average, each person wrote about 5 minutes of dialogue.
I'm beginning to suspect that Walt Disney was running a laundering ring, and this is just various mates of his that needed to explain income.
Well, the person I was watching it with did point out that they reuse a lot of the same voice actors in this film, and said, well, if they can afford so many story writers, why can't they afford more than 1 voice actor? Which I think is a fair comment.
I love the voice acting in this film. I think of all the films we've seen so far, Alice in Wonderland is just a tour de force of talented voice actors.
I think this leads us into who's that voice actor, a la Pokemon. It's absolutely crazy. There's so many voice actors here that have already appeared in Disney films or are going to appear throughout the 50s and 60s.
If I can draw attention to one in particular, the entire Tweedledum and Tweedledee section, which then turns into them telling a story of the Walrus and the Carpenter, every voice for that 4-minute segment of the film is J. Pat O'Malley, and it's just a fantastic sequence. If you're interested in voice acting in any way, go and watch this segment. And yeah, it is supposed to be Tweedledum and Tweedledee telling a story and doing voices, but there's just a lot of variation and character put into the various voices, and of all the segments, I love that segment, just for the pure voice acting talent that's on show.
You'll probably recognise that he uses some of his voices elsewhere in the works of Disney. He did voice work on Mary Poppins, Robin Hood, 101 Dalmatians. He was Colonel Hearty in The Jungle Book. That voice is definitely the same or very similar voice to the Walrus. So if you're a Disney fan, that sequence will ring a lot of bells for you.
The other weird one that rang a bell out of everything was the flamingo at the end that laughs is the same voice actor as Gus from Cinderella, and I just recognised it instantly from the laugh.
I only do goofy laughs. Not goofy, not that kind of goofy. I do laughs that are generically goofy. That's all I do. That's my union. There's lots and lots of things we could say about the voice actors. Feel free to have a read through about them. I think the other ones that stand out for me is Edwin as the Mad Hatter, who was also the laughing uncle in Mary Poppins. Bill Thompson as the White Rabbit, who is basically doing the same voice as Mr. Shmee, who we will come to shortly. And perhaps most interestingly, Catherine Beaumont as Alice, who not only do I think gives a really strong performance as Alice, she actually gets to emote a lot more than basically every other female Disney protagonist up to this point, and probably the male protagonists as well. It's also interesting that she stuck with this role for so long. She also voices Wendy, and both of them were reprised as late as Kingdom Hearts in 2002, which is astonishing that she was voicing the same character 50 years later.
Now, I'm glad you've mentioned Kingdom Hearts, because it's been a while since we've talked about it.
No, Liam, it's been a while since I've talked about it. You talk about it all the time. I just edit it out.
So if you're not familiar with the Kingdom Hearts games, the first one, it's a solid game with a solid story. I can't really criticise the first one that much, except for one issue, which is the plot is based around what they call the 7 Princesses of Heart, where clearly they're just trying to push to the front the Disney princesses. Now this was in 2003, at which point there was already a lot of Disney princesses to choose from, and for some weird reason, one of the 7 they choose is Alice. She's not even a particularly good or moral character. She's literally just a child.
Yeah, I think this is one of the problems with this film, and we'll move on to the plot in a moment. But whilst I think the vocal performance given to the character of Alice is great, there's so much variance, and I think she does a good job of being someone the audience can latch onto. Alice herself doesn't have any kind of character. She's just an object that things happen to. And that's the nature of Alice in Wonderland. It's not about her having something she needs to set out and do. It's just things happen to her, and those things are quite weird.
Yeah, the film is just a relentless barrage of nonsense, which, I mean, that's what it's setting out to be, so great. But there's no character arc to hold on to. I'm fine with that. Again, this is a children's film, and just having a series of nonsense events happen is good enough, in my opinion.
Let's start working through those nonsense events then. We open on Alice being lectured by her sister, who's desperately trying to teach her. I didn't realise she was meant to be Alice's sister. I assumed she was a teacher or something. Anyway, and Alice is sat in a tree playing with her kitten, basically paying little to no attention to these lessons.
It's a solid opening. She ends up singing a little song about the world that she would like to live in. And I've got to admit, the world she describes in the song is fairly tame. It's just about animals wearing clothes, and I'm like, if that's the limit of your imagination, we're not in for a very exciting film going forwards.
Well, she does say, if I had a world of my own, it would be nonsense. And I thought, did she direct Chicken Little?
And so she sort of is daydreaming and then sees the White Rabbit. Again, the plot, as it is very quick to get started. We're greeted now actually to one of my favourite lines in the film, which is when she sees the White Rabbit, her cat reacts and she responds to the cat and says, "It's just a rabbit with a waistcoat." And then the bit that shocks her is when she notices it has a watch.
Maybe she lives next door to Cinderella, who's constantly putting waistcoats on rabbits.
The voice acting is great and the line delivery is perfect on this line. And that sort of brings me into a general point, which is this is one of the funniest films that I think we've seen so far.
There was one joke that genuinely made me laugh out loud. But I will point it out when we get to it. It's not so much later, though. The other highlight from this opening sequence for me is the actual shot of Alice tumbling backwards into Wonderland. I think it's a great use of perspective and scale, and it very quickly sets the visual tone for the rest of the film.
Talking of the visual tone, this is something that always impresses me when I go back and watch this film, is that this was made in 1951, and we saw a lot of more surreal visuals, but that was only really towards the end of the 50s and really the 60s. So to have something like this exist as early as 1951, it just goes to show the creativity of the animators at Disney.
Not to dwell too much on the production side of things, but this is a film that went through a long production period. Walt Disney originally wanted to make a version of it in the early 1920s and was getting different versions of it written and worked on at different points. At one point, he got a script by Aldous Huxley, who famously wrote Brave New World, which is kind of crazy. It was very meta and was about Lewis Carroll and the actual Alice and all sorts of weird stuff. So yeah, I think this was clearly a passion project for Walt Disney.
Now, I tried to make notes whilst watching this, but it is so pacey, and within the first 20 minutes, there's about 8 different segments. I think back to Fantasia and the package films, where one of the complaints we would have is that some of the segments were just too long. And if you view Alice in Wonderland as just a selection of shorts tied together with the theme of someone walking through Wonderland, the pace is absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, I think they definitely nail what I would say is the defining characteristic of the Alice stories, and that is the dreamlike quality. When you're in a dream, you never really see the seams. You can be running down a supermarket to fighting a bear or whatever, and there's never a jarring point where you go, right, I'm going to leave the supermarket now and fight the bear. They just kind of gradually change. I think this does a really good job of expressing that.
I mean, can we just discuss for a second that your dreams involve supermarkets and fighting bears?
Those are the only ones that are suitable to discuss on the podcast. So when Alice first lands in Wonderland, she finds herself in a room, and we get the growing and shrinking of drink me, eat me, and her trying to unlock the locked door. And the doorknob, of course, talks to her.
It eases you in perfectly. You've had the tumbling section, which is telling you, right, things are going to get weird. You've got a talking doorknob as your entryway to Wonderland, and I think it just sets the tone perfectly, and that's all there really is to say, other than obviously it's setting up the recurring theme of size, which, even watching it, I struggle to keep track of how big Alice is supposed to be at any given moment, because again, it's just so pacey and it is seamless.
But again, I don't think she's meant to necessarily be a fixed size, even when she's not actively changing in size, because the world around her is so fluid. And speaking of fluid, she cries so much that she floods the room and is swept out to sea, where she sees a dodo sailing around on... Is it an upside-down toucan he's on?
Yeah, so the dodo is sailing on an upside-down toucan, both serenading and conducting an arrangement of sea creatures as the tide ebbs and flows, and it's just bizarre. As I say, the whole film is just a relentless barrage of nonsense.
The only thing I really noticed about this section is there's a green parrot that looks suspiciously like a certain other green parrot we've seen in these films, except he's not smoking or wearing clothes.
Which is weird, because this is a universe where it would actually make sense for him to be smoking and wearing clothes, because so many of the other characters are.
Yeah, there's a lot of smoking in this film. Clearly they were fine with it. Pinocchio was clearly a one-off where smoking was bad.
Walt Disney was a smoker, wasn't he?
I assume so.
I always have an image of him with a cigar, so it's like, how dare he be so judgmental in Pinocchio? So after the dodo, I think we move on to Tweedledum and Tweedledee.
We do indeed. We've already talked about voice acting and how well this sequence is done. I very stupidly, when I was looking at voice actors, went, oh, the same person voices Tweedledum as Tweedledee. I am very stupid. So Alice is kind of wandering around, and they're just sort of generally harassing her and telling her off for being rude. And if she tries to leave, they get in her way and keep asking her questions and trying to emotionally blackmail her into spending time with them. The person I was watching it with said, they're just those stereotypical nice guys on the internet who always complain about women. Like, oh, I'm a nice guy, but she just won't give me the time of day.
I tell her lovely stories about walruses eating oysters, and she just ignores me. That is a weird story as well.
It is a weird story. I think it's fairly faithful to the original. To try and get Alice to stay, they tell her the story of the walrus and the carpenter, which is total nonsense, but basically they live on a beach, the walrus goes under the sea to get some oysters that they invite round for tea, and the walrus eats them all. Have I missed anything there? That is the story, right?
No, I think that's it to a T, really. Other than the fact that the walrus is genuinely a little bit terrifying, and I'm wondering if he's ever made it into the roster of Disney villains.
I think there's certainly a case for it. He's pretty damn creepy. He has elements of the coachman from Pinocchio, the leering expression over a table and the creepy moustache.
I also think he directly kills more characters than any other Disney character.
Yeah, by his own hand, certainly. I mean, you've got things like the avalanche in Mulan, but I don't think you'd say Mulan was killing them by her own hands.
He's the second most prolific murderer next to Mulan.
Look, one time I was trying to write a list of all the Disney deaths, and I lost count at Mulan because I was like, just thousands of Huns are killed.
That's always rubbed me the wrong way that one person basically single-handedly takes out almost an entire army, and they're the one person not to get credit for it when the soldiers march into the city.
Look, we'll deal with Mulan when we get to Mulan, alright? We can discuss the injustices then.
So we've got a murderous walrus. This story upsets Alice, but not enough for her to consider spending more time with these creepy men.
The only other note I've got on Tweedledum and Tweedledee is that I hate them.
I'm not sure whether it's the voices or the design, but yeah, I love the segment. Again, The Walrus and the Carpenter, I think is, as I say, just a tour de force of talented voice acting. But Tweedledum and Tweedledee are incredibly creepy. And again, when the exact same voices are used in Mary Poppins, it just irritates me again. But I'm not sure if that's then association with Tweedledum and Tweedledee. Is it a particularly Cockney voice that he's doing?
There's certainly quite a lot of British accents filtering in at this point, and again, that's going to continue throughout the 50s and 60s.
So if I'm correct, we next sort of see Alice again seamlessly wander through the woods and end up at the White Rabbit's house?
Yeah, and I think this is one of the most dreamlike things, not necessarily because what's happening is especially weird, but a lot of dreams you find yourself compelled to do something, and in this, he comes out and mistakes Alice for someone else, and he orders Alice into the house to find his gloves, even though he'd logically know where they were. And that is such a stereotypical dream scenario where you know you have to do something, but if someone asked you in the cold light of day why, you're just like, well, I just had to. That was what was happening.
And so Alice wanders up into his house, completely lost, decides to help herself to his sweets that he keeps on his dresser, and they're the same that we saw earlier, and as a result, she grows massive and bursts through the house, which is a really memorable image that's burnt into my head from childhood.
And speaking of burned and heads, to get rid of Alice, the White Rabbit enlists the help of the Dodo, happens to be wandering past. And they try a few things. They get a character called Bill the Lizard, who very weirdly shows up in another Disney film later on.
Bill the Lizard might have the only character arc in the whole film.
For people who haven't seen it, can you explain what Bill's character arc is?
This might be my favourite part of the whole film. Bill is just wandering through the woods with a ladder, and so the Dodo recruits him and says, climb up the house, go down the chimney, and scare out the monster. And as he's climbing up the ladder, he sees Alice's eye through the window and has an absolutely massive panic attack. And then he's encouraged by the Dodo to go up and face his fears. He's forced to the top of the roof, shoved down the chimney against his will, which releases lots of soot into the house, causing Alice to sneeze, sending Bill, who's currently trapped in the chimney, just launching into the sky.
He never comes back down. That's the end of Bill.
That's the end of Bill. And all we get is the Dodo smiling and saying, well, there goes Bill.
And how is that a character arc? That's a trajectory arc.
I don't know why I called it a character arc. I think he's just my favourite character in the film because it's completely unrelated to anything. He just shows up and then disappears.
Even in a film that is basically an extended dream sequence, he is totally irrelevant. Just a guy with a ladder who's a lizard.
Now that was actually what I thought might be the joke that you enjoyed from this. Just the Dodo deadpan saying, well, there goes Bill. Because to me, I think that's the best joke in the film.
That wasn't the joke that made me laugh, although it is funny in retrospect.
If a film can make me audibly laugh when I'm watching it on my own, that is an achievement. And I was laughing a lot during this. So I'm obviously very happy and very pleased with it.
So after Bill goes flying, the Dodo decides the best solution is to burn down the White Rabbit's house, because it's got, quote-unquote, a monster in, i.e. Giant Alice. He's very happy to do this very quickly. Even once Alice has shrunk back down and her and the White Rabbit have run off, he's like, well, I've committed to this act of arson, so I'm just going to spend the rest of my life doing it.
And it's a nice sequence because we get the rabbit not wanting to do it, but being brought along for the ride, so to speak. Just unwillingly being made to burn down his own house.
And Alice once again chasing the White Rabbit for no explained reason. runs into the forest where there's a broadly fine musical section with some flowers.
Is chasing the white rabbit a euphemism in the same way that chasing the dragon is?
Or for opium or something?
I feel it's ringing a bell as if it might be, and I can see why at this, because again, she has no purpose in this. She's just endlessly after this white rabbit. Weird aside, I'm sorry. Let's continue with the flowers.
Well, as I say, they sing a song. It's alright. And then the sequence ends when they categorise Alice as a weed and they say, we don't want weeds in our bed. And even though I was by myself, I just sort of raised my eyebrows in a Roger Moore style, like, don't think any of us do.
We also have another really solidly constructed joke here.
Not solid enough to make me laugh out loud.
Which is when the flowers are trying to discuss what type of flower Alice is, and they decide she's a weed, and they start calling her ugly, and this little tiny flower just butts in and goes, well, I think she's pretty. And the mother flower covers him up and says, quiet, bud.
Oh no, that was quite funny, actually. I almost laughed out loud at that. That was the other good joke in the film.
That might be the first child actor giving a performance that I'm okay with, and it's just one line.
Maybe that's why you think it's okay.
After the flowers, again, it's a broadly fine sequence. I think the song is okay. It's very dated, but it's fine. After this, Alice ends up with a caterpillar, if I'm not mistaken.
She does, and we're going to talk about the Tim Burton Alice in Wonderland at the end, but it did make me think, Alan Rickman was great at this role.
Yeah, I think Alan Rickman was great, and he was different enough, but sort of reminiscent of the original performance, and I think this might be one of my favourite vocal performances in the film, just not in terms of, showing the breadth, but just in creating a character, and it's a very strong, striking character that is memorable, and it's all because of the voice work.
I also think the caterpillar is one of the best animated of the characters, purely because it's an example of ostensibly a very sedentary, simple character, but they have him do all these different poses and doubling back on himself. They have a lot of fun with the smoke, which forms letters and other images to reflect what he's saying. Again, they take a very simple idea, and the animators just run and run with it, and it brings it to life.
Yeah, he's probably the most animated character in the film.
Well, they're all animated characters, Liam.
In the sense of he's lively. Again, they've anthropomorphized him, but they've still kept him very caterpillar-like and moving in a way that is only feasible for the creature they've created, which I think is really nice. Like, you compare that to something like the March Hare, where it's like, hey, this is just a human that looks like a rabbit. And again, the smoke is absolutely fantastic. I love the enunciation, all based around the repeated who are you. That's all I wanted to do.
That's a good impression. Is it relevant to the analysis? No. Did I enjoy it? Yes. Hey, I brought the Jungle Book into a previous episode just so I could do an impression of a character that's got cut from the Jungle Book. Because I'm happy with my impression.
I feel like, of all the Disney films, this is the one where guys in their 30s just have all of the impressions for.
Well, speaking of which, we move into the next section where we encounter maybe the most beloved of these characters, and that is the Cheshire Cat. So if you're playing Sterling Holloway Bingo at home, you can scratch him off because he appears once again, this time as the Cheshire Cat.
This is probably my favourite use of Professor Holloway's voice.
I refuse to call him Professor Holloway.
I'm just exclusively referring to him as such now. I know that obviously he's most famous for Winnie the Pooh, and there's a few coming up that I think are very suited, but again, it's very dreamlike and surreal, and his voice just matches perfectly with the animation.
Yeah, once again, this is a scene where Alice is just talking to a cat in a tree, but they come up with so many fun visuals. The one that stands out for me is where the Cheshire Cat says he's not all there, and as he's saying that, the lines along him are disappearing, and he's literally disappearing. Again, just very inventive, but also very well animated.
And is it the Cheshire Cat at this point who directs Alice to the tea party?
He does indeed. We encounter, again, probably one of the most memorable sections. I think the last 20 minutes of this are probably what people remember the most. And the Mad Hatter's Tea Party is certainly one of the most memorable sections.
I find this segment exhausting.
Oh, thank God, I'm so glad you said that. I do too.
At this point, you've sat through about 40 minutes of just non-stop nonsense. And then you're greeted to as much as you've sat through, condensed into about 3 minutes.
To be fair to Alice, the sequence ends in the same way it would if I was there, of her just going, I've had enough of this, I'm just going to leave.
I can definitely see why it's become one of the more embraced sort of elements in popular culture. The idea of Mad Hatter's Tea Party is fairly common.
And the song, A Very Merry Birthday to You, is probably the most memorable. I've had it stuck in my head since watching this film. I don't like having it stuck in my head, but it's there.
Luckily, that's not the one that's been stuck in my head all day, because we've got one more coming up that is, in my opinion, the catchiest. I mean, I've still got it stuck in my head now, just the whole time we've been talking. Yeah, I enjoy that they ended the sequence with Alice just sort of putting her foot down and leaving and acknowledging that this is just too much even for her.
And to be fair, these characters, even in the world of Wonderland, are considered mad.
I hadn't thought about that.
Although, one thing I don't get, maybe someone can advise me on this. So, the Mad Hatter comes from hatters used to line hats with mercury, I think?
Yes.
So they would get mercury poisoning and go mad. That's where the Mad Hatter meme comes from. And obviously the March Hare is the phrase mad as a March Hare, i.e. basically when they're on heat, that they act crazy. What's the dormouse in relation to? Is it like, as mad as a dormouse in a teapot? Is that a thing?
Knowing Lewis Carroll, it's probably some deep critique of the Society of Mathematics.
I have something to say on Lewis Carroll, but I'll save it to the end. The only other memorable thing from this sequence is they pose the question, how is a raven like a writing desk? Which is often presented in Alice in Wonderland as this unsolvable nonsense riddle. You probably know this, Liam, but Lewis Carroll did write a solution to it, and he just didn't put it in any of the books. So I'm going to share it, because it's interesting.
Is this because Poe wrote on both?
Well, I've heard that one. The answer I believe Lewis Carroll originally came up with is they can both produce a few low notes and are never put backwards. Notes obviously being a pun on writing and the notes that Raven produces, but also you don't put a desk backwards because you can't sit at it, and Raven backwards is never. So there you go. Useless trivia.
I like that it's considered one of the pinnacles of nonsense as an example within the story, and it's probably the thing that almost makes the most sense.
Those are the parts of the writing. A lot of the Cheshire Cat's lines are like this, where it's sort of nonsense, but also actually, in a twisted way, does make sense. Again, there's a bit with the Mad Hatter and the March Hare, where they ask her for more tea, and she says, I can't very well have more tea, you've not given me any yet. And they said, well, you can't have less tea then, but you can always have more tea than nothing, which makes sense. But he's also irritating.
I think that's a good way to describe this film in general.
After Alice has had enough of their nonsense then, she bumps into the Cheshire Cat again, who gives her the shortcut to the Red Queen's.
Before that, it's just a very quick point, which is we're treated to, again, some more animator creativity. I'm not sure if this is from the illustrations in the books, but there is just a series of birds that are merged with everyday objects. My favourite of which is probably the shoveling bird, who is constantly just digging holes and filling them in.
Yeah, I'd completely forgotten about this section, because even by this film's standards, it doesn't really link to the so-called plot. But yeah, there's some really nice inventive imagery here, and it's also kind of where Alice gets maybe a vague motivation that she actually has had enough of this and wants to go home, which is sort of the driving force for the last act of the film.
All it took was the Mad Hatter and the March Hare.
We've all been there. We're at a social engagement and someone's so annoying we go, I just want to go home.
I was going to make a joke about that never having happened to me, but I think it's just too low-hanging fruit. So yeah, we are now in the final segment, which is Alice interacting with the Queen of Hearts, which is the only part of the film that can be said to have any kind of a plot.
It's almost like a self-contained short. As you say, they establish a world. Visually, it's very different to the rest of the film. You've got this royal estate vibe going on, and leads into what I think is the best song of the film, and presumably is the catchiest one for you, Painting the Roses Red.
I love it. I've had it stuck in my head since watching this morning, and it's probably going to be stuck in my head long into tomorrow.
As someone who hails from Yorkshire, I see it as flagrantly Lancashire propaganda, that they are taking the beautiful white rose and tarnishing it with the red.
I was wondering how you were going to feel about the roses and the dismissing of the white rose and the superiority of the red rose.
I'm actually being very facetious. I don't care. It doesn't mean anything.
There is something we'll discuss at the end of the podcast that I think might make you a bit happy.
I'm excited. I'll tell you what else makes me happy, and it's a joke in this section. The Queen of Hearts is coming, so they announce all the hearts from the ace to the jack. The White Rabbit runs up and gives this big announcement, and the Queen of Hearts, she's this huge character. She enters, and everyone cheers and roars. And then the king, this guy who's maybe 2 feet tall, waddles over to the rabbit and taps him on the shoulder, and the rabbit goes, "And also the king." And just out of shot, you hear one voice go, "Hooray!" It's really funny.
The king is just a very good comedic character. He's only used as the butt of jokes, and it's always funny every time they do it. One other thing that stood out in this segment is there's a lot of execution in this segment. Still doesn't rival the walrus, but she's close.
Of course, the Queen of Hearts has this oscillating behaviour where she seems to quite favour Alice. She says, "Oh, come on, girl," and she's kind of correcting Alice on her etiquette and things like that, and she wants to play croquet with her. But also, obviously, as soon as anyone crosses her, off with their head, and they're dragged off. Now, I imagine the cards at this point have decided that, due to the clear instability of the Queen of Hearts, and also her inability to distinguish between any of them, I suspect they just drag the cards out and they just go to the back of the deck. Because the Queen's never going to realise it's the same person. They probably realise fairly early on that we don't all need to die here.
I'm actually impressed by how much card-based physicality they use in this segment. They're not just cards that look like cards. They're shuffled, they move around like cards. It's just a really nice animated segment.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think, again, that's an example where they went with the theme and ran with it. And we obviously get the nonsense croquet game where they're using flamingos and hedgehogs. Again, I think this is a very famous visual and also a very famous sequence in and of itself.
Yeah, and during the croquet match, the Cheshire Cat pops up again. He's been showing up at various points. This time, he shows up just to wind up the Queen in various ways, and he ends up tucking the beak of the flamingo into her dress so that when she swings, she flips herself over, and Alice gets the blame.
And naturally, the Queen jumps to off with her head, and the King, for reasons I don't really understand, says, "Well, she should probably have a trial." So they go, "Yeah, all right." And they drag her off to a courthouse. And they're bringing in the Mad Hatter and the March Hare and the Dormouse as witnesses, and the Queen keeps telling the jury to write down various nonsense phrases saying it's important evidence, and nothing really makes sense or has any through line, and I was still sat there thinking, this is still a more rational trial than the O.J. Simpson one. I can say that on a Disney podcast, right?
Yeah, you can go with that, that's fine.
Yeah, it's fine.
I really like the trial. I think each of the witnesses they bring up, they're different enough in the jokes they make. I remember the March Hare being quite aggressive towards the Queen and her being okay with that. The Mad Hatter is obviously just mad and is just contributing to the nonsense. If there is one thing I would change about this film, it's that I wouldn't have the Mad Hatter, the March Hare and the Dormouse be the witnesses. I would take witnesses from throughout the film.
Yeah, it seems like an odd decision because I think the first one they bring is the March Hare and you go, oh, we're going to get characters from different sequences. Nope, just from the Tea Party. The Dodo's a literal arsonist. Get him into court.
He's too busy burning down the house still.
One thing I love about this sequence is they're just going through all this nonsense and there's a few shots of Alice and she just looks so bored. I also, on the subject of Alice's facial expressions, at one point I paused it. I think it's very early on when she's at sea with the dodo. And I paused it to get some food. And I'll put it in the YouTube video, but she looks so pissed off.
Again, they really managed to hit the nail on the head with her character, where at no point is she won over by or swept into the nonsense. She's always just like, well, this is just silly. And it's good, because again, that's kind of her character, is that she starts off the film being the silly one and wanting this nonsense wonderland, and then she gets it, and she's just like, this is rubbish.
So to get out of trouble, Alice uses the mushroom she got from the caterpillar to grow very large. And we're told no one over a mile high can be in the courtroom. That's Rule 42. And I thought, how did Rule 34 come up before this?
when I was watching this, I was like, wait a minute, is that... And then I remembered that actually, no, it's Rule 34 is the one you're referring to. Rule 42, I believe, is always bring a towel after The Hitchhiker's Guide.
Ah, of course.
Not that we should give any attention or credence to the, quote, rules of the internet, because they're just creepy.
Oh, for sure. So, the court case ends in a farce, Alice runs away, and then she's chased back through all the different vistas she's encountered. Things get increasingly frantic until she finds herself back at the locked door at the start. She looks through the keyhole and sees herself asleep by the tree. She shouts to herself and wakes herself up.
Now, I don't know if you have ever suffered from sleep paralysis, but this is a recurring thing for me where I am aware of my sleeping body and feel there is imminent danger, and I'm trying everything to wake my sleeping body up, and it's terrifying.
So this is a real nightmare situation for you then?
Oh yeah, it just is bringing back all sorts of horrible feelings. I'm not sure if Disney was specifically going for sleep paralysis, of being like, right, this is what we need to get across here, but he achieved it perfectly.
My main thought of sleep paralysis is a film, I think it was called Awake. It had Hayden Christensen and I want to say Jessica Alba in, and it's about people being conscious during operations. And that film is a nightmare, but in a very different way.
I think my worst encounter with it... Sorry, this is just going to be an aside for a second. I do apologise, but you all have to experience my terror. The weirdest example I've had was where I kept waking up and being unable to move. And every time I would finally succeed in sort of moving part of my body and standing up, I would then wake up again and realise all of that was a dream. And it was just this endless loop, and I was like, I think I'm dead, and I think this is hell.
Maybe you just felt that part of the dreamscape in Inception where your brains just go to mush.
Do you think that's what's happening to Alice at this point?
And that's basically it. She wakes up, her sister's like, you're asleep, you're not even listening. And Alice recites a bit of the nonsense she picked up from earlier in the film. And then it just ends. And we're given quite a cold ending. And cold is the word I think I use to describe this film. Walt Disney himself said that he felt that it was the main problem with the film, is that it's very hard to connect with on an emotional level because it's very witty and very charming and entertaining, but there's no character arcs other than Bill. There's no real plot. There's not even really a moral or any kind of underlying themes. It's just some weird stuff.
Now, I have a very specific way of judging a film, which is to decide whether I believe it achieves what it sets out to do. And for all of those issues, this is a solid hour of just nonsense. And in adapting Alice in Wonderland, I think that's all you can really hope for. I don't expect to be able to connect with it on an emotional level. I just want to be exposed to a bit of witty nonsense for a while.
And I guess that leads nicely into talking about the Tim Burton adaptation, because I feel that's an instance where they didn't want to do a faithful adaptation of Alice in Wonderland in terms of this dreamlike barrage of nonsense. They instead wanted to do a narrative-based film set in that world. And I think the outcome of it, for me, is quite simple, which is, although I think the visuals are stunning and the casting, as you say, is great, I really like Matt Lucas as Tweedledum and Tweedledee, it doesn't really work as an Alice's Adventures in Wonderland film because that's not what it is. It's not fluid enough. And I don't think it really works as a Tim Burton film because it doesn't really have his identity or themes on it. It just feels like he's trying to do someone else's story. So I think it's quite bad.
I'm surprised you think it's a attractive film because, I mean, I hate this film and I think it's one of the ugliest things I've ever seen. It's from that weird era of 3D filmmaking where everything looks fake and it's just this gross, dark looking interpretation of Wonderland. And at parts you're thinking it works for the story because she's supposed to be returning to Wonderland and seeing that it's under tyrannical rule. But then in the sequel, and also when things are resolved at the end, it's like, no, that's just what Wonderland looks like. It's just dull and ugly. I want to like this film. I think on paper it should work. Tim Burton is absolutely a person you can see doing an adaptation of Alice in Wonderland. I think the casting overall is fantastic. I think every casting choice is great. Mia Wasikowska is really good casting for Alice in Wonderland. Again, I think she's probably one of the most beautiful and charming people in the world, and it's a shame that she is known as the Alice in Wonderland woman because pretty much everything else she's done is great. Again, I can't recommend Alice in Wonderland, the Tim Burton film, but I can recommend basically anything with Mia Wasikowska in. Only Lovers Left Alive, great supporting role there. Judy and Punch, one of the more recent ones, fantastic. Crimson Peak is probably the only other big studio one that she did, and it's great. She's really good. The interpretation of Alice in this is just not good.
Overall, I think it's just a bit of a cynical cash grab. It's like they said, there's a certain echelon of people who like the creepy kookiness of both Tim Burton and Alice in Wonderland. Let's just mash the two together and people will buy it. I haven't seen the sequel, although as far as I can tell, Sacha Baron Cohen's character is just Entropy from Crash Bandicoot 3.
Yes, he is, and he's the best thing in the film. I really can't recommend the second. I think it is worse in every way, and the first one's not great as it is. But I do recommend that if you're listening to this and you haven't seen either of the films, go and watch the opening sequence of the second Alice in Wonderland film, and the whole time just keep telling yourself this is an adaptation of Alice in Wonderland. And that's all I'm going to say about the second one. But yeah, I'm trying to work out where it goes wrong, because, as I say, director's a great choice, the cast is all great, the screenwriter is the screenwriter of Beauty and the Beast. And then I remembered actually the first draft of Beauty and the Beast, not great, so that was mostly saved by the producers and bringing in Howard Ashman, but again, we'll get to that. And I even like the idea of doing a kind of return to Oz, where Alice is at this turning point in her life and she comes back to Wonderland and finds that it has changed without her, or even that it was always kind of messed up. I think of things like American McGee's Alice, the video game, because again, it's a common trope to sort of look at Alice in Wonderland and go, this is the world as seen through the eyes of a child. Is it much darker and actually quite sinister when you're looking at it through more adult eyes? And I think that's a good angle to go with, and Tim Burton would have nailed that, but they never really do anything with it. They just want to sort of have a big epic fantasy battle. The fact that you can describe in that film Johnny Depp's Mad Hatter as the leader of a resistance tells you everything you need to know about why that film doesn't work.
Well, we've talked about the 1951 animated classic Alice in Wonderland, and we've also talked about the two Tim Burton films. Is there anything else we need to talk about?
Before we round off, we just need to decide which character in Alice in Wonderland is the sexiest. And I've got to admit, I'm not looking forward to this conversation.
Well, maybe I can save you from this one, Liam, because, unlike Lewis Carroll himself, I have no interest in sexualising Alice.
That wasn't why I wasn't looking forward to this. It was that there's not really anyone to choose from.
Well, that was my first thought too, but then I was like, I guess I'm going to go with Alice's sister, because she's a normal human, seemingly adult woman.
I was really struggling. I had to go through again, fast forward, to just see if there was any characters that weren't just weird nonsense animals. And you'll be glad to hear this as a native of York. During the flower sequence, there is a particularly sexy looking white rose.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think I've got to go with the sexy white rose.
There you go, then. The sexiest characters in Alice in Wonderland are Alice's sister and a sexy white rose.
It entirely comes down to what you prefer, whether you prefer the conservative look of, is it the Edwardian period?
I guess so.
Yeah, so it comes down to whether you prefer the conservative look of the Edwardian period, where, you might get a slip of Alice's sister's ankle, or if you prefer flowers. And those are your options.
And with that, Liam, we open up the vault and you step in, and I can see you readying the quill there and unrolling the parchment that contains the definitive list of Waly Gisnep's animated classics. Liam, what is your hand telling you to do? And keep it clean.
I've got my quill. I'm dipping it into my cup of tea. I want to put it on, I think.
Well, hold that quill.
I imagine you don't. I'm not too sold on it, but personally, I think this achieves everything it sets out to do. And even if what it sets out to do is very simple, it achieves it, and that alone I want to write on the list.
I agree that it does do what it sets out to do, and it does it well. I think it's probably my favourite adaptation of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, but I find it difficult to watch as a film.
I'm surprised by that, because I find it a really enjoyable and pacey film. I was chuckling to myself throughout, and I just had a really nice time watching it. Yeah, I'm surprised that you find it difficult to watch.
I can happily sit and watch any one of the sequences individually, but it doesn't even really feel like a film. I find it hard to put it into any further words than that, really. I think you know what Alice in Wonderland is. If you like that sort of thing, you'll probably like this version of the film. If you don't, this isn't going to change your mind about it. And for me, I don't think the original books are quite the stone cold classics maybe they're made out to be. Even though this is doing a good job of adapting them, it doesn't really resonate with me.
I think I'm okay with that, so I'll put it in the waiting list.
And with that, we close the vault of Waly Gisnep's classics until next week, where we are going to be looking at the 1953 animated classic Peter Pan. In the meantime, I've been Ben, and if you correctly agree with me that Alice doesn't deserve to go on the list of Waly Gisnep's classics, please let us know.
And if you're a fan of the absurd, I've got the tea ready and waiting for it to go on the list.
Otherwise, we will see you next time. Thank you very much for listening.